Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor, Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
And me, Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
In this All Right in Sin City, you'll hear part 2 of The Poison City, Flint's Water and the American Urban Tragedy. In this episode, author Anna Clark will continue her commentary about her award-winning book and the Flint Water crisis. She's joined by Flint-based writer and former journalist Robert Campbell. You'll also hear additional questions and commentary from moderator and Windsor community organizer Steve Green. This presentation was recorded in July at Biblioasis Bookstore in Windsor, Ontario. Anna Clark is a journalist in Detroit. The Poison City was named one of the year's best books by The Washington Post, the San Francisco Chronicle, Kirkus Reviews, Audible, Amazon, the New York Public Library, and others. It is the winner of the Hillman Prize in Book Journalism and the Rachel Carson Environmental Book Award, and more. And now, here's Anna Clark and Robert Campbell talking about The Poisoned City.
We have a profound, blessing really and responsibility with this water. Michigan calls itself the Great Lakes State, and we also call ourselves Pure Michigan. That's kind of the branding campaign. And yet somehow we also have become the face worldwide of this dramatic drinking water crisis, which in itself is terrible and bizarre. But it's also not singular to Flint in so many ways. And I tried to, in this book, tell Flint's unique story while also making clear this isn't a story that begins and ends at their borders. The afterword that's in this paperback is kind of talking about how the word Flint itself has become a kind of totem or a touchstone, the word that people use when talking about challenges in their own communities, certainly about water, but I think also about democracy and environmental justice and these kind of much broader structural issues. In some cases, it is used as a galvanizing cry, this challenge we're having is worse than Flint or just like Flint. That's how the shorthand people use. And otherwise, it's used to kind of pat down challenges, we're not as bad as Flint. We're not like Flint. You could see this all the time. You could see this even in a wealthy suburb of Detroit that had some lead and water issues. It was because of a variety of what I would consider ridiculous, very loose requirements. It only has to test five water samples a year for lead. 5. It's like a small village, but still. Because of the notoriety of Flint, an individual kind of asked, hey, can you test our house too? They just asked to be on the roster. So this year they had 6. And the 6th one, that extra one, showed very high lead levels, high enough that with just a small sample size, it was enough to tip the city over into, violation stuff. And the city was having none of it. They're nope, drop it. They're filing legal challenge. They don't want to deal with it. And the city council president, when somebody was kind of discussing this, I'm concerned, was don't worry about it. We're not Flint. They used it as a way to kind of pat things down. People. I think a lot of people believe their privilege protects them to the point where they're totally immune, and they are more protected. That's real, but it's they're not immune. And to not find any way to kind of tell the story of communities in this very old, separate and unequal way, you're harming everybody, yourselves and others, And with infrastructure, kind of bringing it back to the pipes, I think there's an opportunity to talk about, in fact, how we are connected, and very literally, we are healthier when all of us are connected, when we have access to safe, healthy drinking water. We've tried to do it in separate and unequal ways, from those private water departments to this day with rampant water shutoffs and so on. It makes everybody less healthy and safe. And despite our ways of trying to divide ourselves up, I think drinking water and infrastructure kind of proves a lie, like scientifically as well as morally. Like, we do actually all need each other to be able to thrive. So I'm going to pause here. I'd love to pass it on to Bob here. Excuse me. So, Bob, just as a quick introduction, I met him over the last few years while I was like hanging out in Flint. I actually don't really remember when.
Yeah, I think it was with the literary festival.
Flint Literary Festival, or Flint Festival of Writers.
Yeah, we just changed the name.
Yeah.
So I'm on this committee. We do a writing festival. We've been doing it for 3 years. Well, this will be the 3rd year. So the first year we did it. I can't remember if you were.
I think I was on a panel that year. Yeah,
that's right. And so that's how we met.
Yeah. And he's a writer too. Tell us about your writing.
So I'm a writer. I'm a former journalist, although I haven't been a journalist for a while now. But I was a journalist for 10 years. I now work in public relations, but I also do creative writing. I have a novel that is coming out this fall by Windsor-based Urban Farmhouse Press, so I'm really looking forward to that. It's titled Motown Man.
Yay!
There's a couple of things to to piggyback on something Anna said about being in this together. That's kind of what I touch on in a lot of my writing. I write a lot about belonging and identity, inclusiveness, and a lot of it has a strong connection to race, not surprisingly. But in going back to your point about sort of being all in this together, I remember at the height of the water crisis, I grew up in Flint. I don't live in Flint. I live in the suburb of Flint now, but I grew up in Flint and lived there for 28 years or so. And someone made a really interesting comment, and it was something to the effect that Flint, with all of its racial history and challenges, that the white community within Flint is sort of getting a taste of what it means to be black. And I'm kind of paraphrasing that, but that was sort of to the effect. And that's kind of what I've sort of covered in some of the writing that I do, and particularly in the novel that I wrote. It's sort of this idea of sort of two different communities, if you will, coming together. It's a love story based in a city very much like Flint, but it's sort of this, as sort of challenges of courtship and when you're considering getting married and whatnot, and you're kind of blending these two families, or the idea of it. So that's kind of this metaphor of looking at some of the racial challenges and issues in a city like Flint. And it also touches on some of the de-industrialization issues that have plagued Flint so much. The other thing, too, that's really interesting about the water crisis, that Flint from, let's say post-war, particularly through the 50s and 50s into the late 60s, really the city on the hill. I mean, just fabulously wealthy for a working class city, and it didn't require a whole lot of knowledge, education, in order to live a very middle class life. And my family certainly benefited from that. And then sort of fall from that height to the depths that we've come to now. It's sort of this constant weight in some cases, and so it's almost too like, first there was Roger and me. Well, go back. Before Roger and me, there was sort of the whole disinvestment from GM, as they are things brought on by industry competition, gas prices, and the like. Jobs go away, factories are closed, and then there's Roger and me. So Flint is sort of held up as this, this poster child of deindustrialization and industry abandoning cities. So there's that, and so there was a generation that you dealt with on that. So just as you're sort of getting through the whole Roger and me thing, then the water crisis hit, and it's kind of like, geez, what? Can we catch a break here? And so, but it really, in some ways, helped to sort of galvanize sense, the identity of the city's residents and people who are very connected to the city, and I include myself in that group, about having a sense of resiliency and sort of stick-to-itiveness. And so I think there's something really to that. And I'm to sort of, off on a tangent a little bit. I lived in Kentucky for 5 years, my wife and I did, so Upper South. Even though it was a border state, it stayed with the Union, it still had slaves. So we got a real good taste of sort of Southern culture. And in some ways, Flint kind of reminds me of sort of, the whole lost cause idea, that there was this idea of what the South was before the Yankees came down and changed their way of life. In some ways, there's a little bit of that with Flint, with some of the older baby boomer generation, people who sort of grew up during sort of those heydays, those days of wealth, when the Mott Foundation was, the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, very wealthy philanthropist, was dumping tons and tons of money into the school system and into the city and whatnot, and sort of helped to make for this very well-kept city. And so today, there's this generation that you really look back on those years very longingly, like, oh man, those were the sort of the lost cause years. But in having grown up there, and a lot of my writing is sort of based on that experience. I think that some of the things that Anna gets into in her book were really, really fascinating, particularly as you get into sort of the class and racial issues related to the lack of investment that occurred over time. Because it was kind of interesting to sort of observe how over time the city became poorer and poorer as the outside suburban areas, the ring, became more prosperous.
It's like hollowed out center,
And it's really, it's sad in a lot of ways too, because I have this. I'm a contributor to a forthcoming anthology called Midwest Architectural Journeys by Belt Publishing, and one of the pieces, or the piece that I wrote about, looks at. I'm really anxious to see how it's going to be received by the broader community, because it really takes a look at some of the leftover architectural gems in downtown, things like the Mott Foundation building, First National Bank building, which is, so these really fine examples of really early 20th century architecture, 1920s, when Flint was a city on the rise. Then there was another period post-war when there was when it became a real playground for architects for the international style of modernism. Mid-century modernism. So anyway, but the piece I wrote about really kind of talks about some of these early, 1920s era buildings that still exist, but they're surrounded by a lot of flat parking lots, because so much of the downtown has been bulldozed for parking lots, and it's sort of this while paying tribute to these architectural artifacts that we have left over, longing for a time when some of these flat lots are replaced with contemporary architecture of the day, and that sort of goes to the whole idea of us. Part of the reason why these buildings were torn down was to make room for parking lots for cars, people to drive into town, because they had since moved out. And so part of the piece, or part of the message of the piece, at least I hope sort of comes through, is that with the density will come a greater sense of togetherness, of inclusiveness, that sort of help to make the city what it used to be. We could be that again, in at least I hope. What else?
Well, that's. I think that that's real. I feel like living in cities, and I feel this in Detroit too, but living in cities that have lost more than half their population. it's not just gone. Like, you feel the ghosts. Like, you can see the remnants, these, like, vacant spaces, pipes that go to nowhere. You know, this is why their rates were so expensive, is because the water system's built for not just twice as many people, but also those huge GM factories that aren't there anymore. So you have far fewer people shouldering the burden of a totally outside system. It's just impossible. So the rates are expensive, and it still wasn't enough to keep it up. This is before any of the mistreatment. I mean, you feel like the physical weight of those who aren't there anymore. You know. But maybe this is a good time. Yeah, like you're our guy here.
First, I want to say thank you very much for traversing the border and coming over and sharing your wisdom and readings. We really appreciate that, having you over here. And before you leave, we'll make sure that we completely douse you in maple syrup. Send you back now that it's you're back from.
Totally initiated into Canada.
You touched on, we screeched in, as they say in Newfoundland. So.
Don't forget the butter tarts.
I don't even know what that is. I'm such a newbie.
So, I'm going to start with a couple questions. I'm going to ask two, and then I'm going to go to our guests here so that they can participate as well. But you've already, you kind of brought them up, and I want to ask both of you the question. Where do you think Flint would be today, the people of Flint, and where the crisis would be today, if it was not for the grassroots community of Flint that organized and brought this crisis to the forefront?
You want to? I think that Flint, to its credit, because the Mott Foundation is still there, I think that carries a lot of weight. So I think that had it not been for a Mott Foundation, I think things could have been quite dire. But because of that influence, that wealth, I think that helped.
It's like the ghost wealth. It's like the auto wealth of the past,
Yeah. So I do think that for whatever criticisms there may be of the foundation, and I think some are perhaps valid, I do think that that's one thing that did help to sort of focus some attention on, and then too the fact that General Motors still has a sizable investment there. I mean, it makes its heavy duty trucks in Flint, and heavy duty trucks are the bread and butter of GM.
They cut everything out.
So, so I do think those two things had a significant impact on.
Yeah, I mean, and that's interesting, like, because like the institution piece, and like and I guess that, like, in the terms with and this kind of ties to the auto stuff too, is like the activism piece. Like, one thing that really struck me about Flint is, like, this is a town that's like been like inherited this tradition of community organizing, right? Like, so like from the sit down strike at GM in the 1930s that. Side note, I found out my great-grandfather was one of those dudes. I didn't know it until I was working on this. It was a remarkable feat. They like occupied like several factories for like 44 days. They're asking for safer conditions and better pay and the right to collectively bargain. And GM's like roaring, at its like worldwide peak and like one of the most powerful companies in the face of the planet, and these like workers won. They totally won. They got, it was like effectively the founding of the United Auto Workers, which totally changed the whole century. I mean, and then so you could see this tradition play out again like in the civil rights era, and I think you can see it again in this water activism era, where it's not a coincidence that many of the leaders were like had been union people. And I think a lot of that, I think that did play an important role because it did help kind of put on the record, that there was some dissent, like and trying to like people kind of documenting that like this is what's happening. Nobody really totally knew what was going on at the time, but even before they totally understood, we're like trying to get the word out about it and just take care of each other. I mean, people were doing independent bottled water drives well before this was like acknowledged as a citywide crisis, and so just meeting each other's health needs, I think, was important and helped kind of create a blueprint that ended up being activated in a much bigger way once the crisis was acknowledged and some resources were coming in. So yeah, I think it was pretty critical. I think it's like something a lot of other cities can learn from when you're trying to deal with something that seems a problem, but it's hard to put your finger on, like how they work together. It's really useful.
And just to piggyback on that real quick, sort of like that architecture piece I was just talking about, there's still some remnants of some very significant institutions. You don't have the critical mass or the density, I keep coming back to that you once had, but there's still some very significant pieces still in place in the city that that once they sort of came together and kind of recognized that, hey, wait a minute here, if we pull together,
that same organization imprinted on the folks that were still there.
Correct.
The remnant of that, or that watermark was still there and pushed it forward.
Churches were really important. That was like a gathering place for people, like meeting, water distribution place, like a lot of churches, which are some of the last neighborhood anchors. I think like in a lot of cases are the last ways that for people who are leaving, it was like the last thing they kept coming back to was like a community church. Like I think so, and that I think a lot of them played a pretty pivotal role in making connections and helping people out.
And before we go to the guests, I got one more question. I hope it doesn't take up too much time, but it might be a bit sensitive. I want to know, and this has been a big point of conversation with some of the folks that I've been talking about this book too. I want to know what you think about the role of structural and environmental racism and how it played out into the crisis in Flint. What kinds of warning signs should citizens be on the lookout to make sure that we are not similarly setting up marginalized communities to bear the brunt of environmental degradation, or like you mentioned, the sacrificial zones, the sacrificial people. I got some thoughts about that.
It's a good question. Warning signs is an interesting piece of that question too. I mean, it is. I was talking to Theo a little bit earlier. This is like one of the results of this water crisis is I think it did have a very chilling effect on just about everybody, including people who do not talk about structural racism in a day-to-day way, where people were very, very clear that this would not have happened in any other city, or in wealthier and whiter cities. I mean, it's just like, first of all, like what led up to the switch in the first place, and emergency management, which is still a law. That's an unchanged law in Michigan right now. But most especially going a year and a half of not taking anybody's concerns seriously, even when they're validated by an entire factory, switching its water. Even when other state agencies that have departments in Flint were like, you know what, we're just going to bring in some bottled water. You know what I mean? People were continually discounted and belittled, even accused of bringing in like fake water, like they had browned it themselves just to get attention or get resources, and people were really like treated poorly, and were right, you know, like, I mean, they turned out to be right. And I think I think that once that like story became clear to a lot of folks, I do think I like to think it like woke up a lot of people about how people don't have the same experience of like democracy, you know, and the places where we've concentrated poverty and people of color, which are generally the same places, are like do not have access, you know, to the same kind of like public services or civic rights, you know, that other places have, and I like to think that like can help us get us to the next step of dismantling the ways that like that way inequality is embedded in our public policy, the way we've like created those, or allowing them to perpetuate. Though I think that is also one of the unresolved pieces of the water crisis.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No. Please. Yeah.
Yeah. I agree with that entirely, and I won't get into sort of the specifics of environmental racism. Anna covers that great, but I will say this on a more basic level. There's clearly this challenge, our communities who clearly still have this challenge of, hey, is this our problem, i.e. a white problem, or is it their problem?
Yeah.
And,
Tough.
And it's just, without bringing U.S. politics into this, we got a president that is sort of really exploiting that whole rift, or doing what he can to try to, and so, I certainly believe that, had a similar situation occurred in the community I live in, which is predominantly white, that it would have been received very differently for a host of reasons. And so And certainly social class has something to do with that, but its race has something to do with that too, and it's part of the legacy of that we continue to grapple with as a nation.
Yeah.
There's nothing more I would like to do but to monopolize the entire time with the 8 other well-crafted questions I have for you. I want to make sure that folks have an opportunity to ask some questions too. So, is there anyone that wants to ask a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a kind of a basic question. What is the population of Flint now, and what was the population during its heyday, approximately?
So it's about 97,000 today. At its peak, it was probably 200,000. I mean, officially, it was 193,000. I think it was the 1960 census. So let's say 200,000. So it's half the size, or less than that.
One thing that was kind of interesting, like Flint hooked on to Detroit for the first time in the 60s with the idea that they were like that size and going to ever grow.
Yeah.
That's why they we need more water. Like they had been getting their water from the river before, like treating it at that old city plant. And there was this whole debate in the 60s of should we build our own pipe to Lake Huron? Should we join Detroit? It's a big thing. They ended up going with Detroit. That pipe became activated in 1967, and it's kind of haunting because Flint had already kind of peaked, and it was going and its population has been sliding ever since. Let alone the industry and stuff that they were trying to support by thing not being what it was either. So, and that's
there was a new Flint
frustrating
plan that was devised in the late 50s, and I think it finally fell apart in the early 60s. But they're projecting a city a size of about 300,000.
Yeah.
And geographically, it was going to probably be about twice the size of what it is today.
And it shouldn't be lost that this population started going down in 1970. Where Flint peaked and where it started going down, and this is the pattern of cities like it all over the country, is when after we passed school desegregation laws and the Fair Housing Act, open housing and stuff, that and plus built the highways, and then we're boom, we just it's just people are you know what, I'm out. And even if they were a civil rights supporter, we had built discrimination into our housing system so much that even if you your property values are literally going down simply because you happen to have an integrated neighborhood now. You're literally going, and if your retirement's dependent on that and your kids' well-being depends on that, even if you were a white person who was could see what was going on, you might be I gotta go. It's a rational, created a system that made it a rational decision to leave, and to, and I feel that, just we haven't totally dealt with the legacy of lead, that's still with us, even though we've had some good laws, we haven't dealt with the way, we've made segregation a self-perpetuating force, even when you know better and feel better, we made it a self-perpetuating force. So we got to undo the roots of that to get us so we don't have sacrifice zones anymore.
You've been listening to part 2 of a talk with Anna Clark about her award-winning book, The Poison City, Flint's Water and the American Urban Tragedy. For the background on the conditions behind the Flint water crisis and how the tragedy happened, check out part 1, available on our website or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.